Hello, my name is Brennan Baybeck. I'm the Vice President of Global IT Risk Management at Oracle Corporation. And joining me today is Jake Martens, who's the Director of Technical Security Services at Oracle Corporation. Welcome, Jake.
Thank you.
Jake is a resident expert on the topic that we're going to discuss today, which is mobile security and bring your own device, and how those two relate together and what companies should do about that. So Jake, welcome again. Thank you. I think to start off, we really need to define what bring your own device means and why should companies be concerned about that.
Yeah, definitely. It's a topic we hear about in the news almost every day, and something that companies for sure should take seriously. So BYOD, bring your own device, is really the practice of employees bringing in whatever they want to and attempting, in many cases successfully attempting, to connect to company resources. Maybe a smartphone, could be a tablet, could be an e-reader, could be a personally owned laptop, but this is their equipment that they're bringing into the company and expecting to get connected. Millennials, these younger generation workers that increasingly are infiltrating the workforce, have an expectation to be able to use whatever device they want to and connect to company resources. And it's certainly advantageous for companies in terms of productivity and cost savings to allow those, but it's awfully challenging when you have the depart from the good old days of a Mac shop or a PC shop, or only allowing Android devices or only allowing iOS devices, to have a mixture of all kinds of devices in the environment and the connectivity of those devices into the corporate resources. So it's certainly, I think, here to stay. In 2014 alone, there will be 250 million smartphones sold, and 250 million devices, tablets sold, and nearly 500 million smartphones sold. So that's approaching 1 billion devices, mobile devices, that will be sold around the world this year alone. And certainly many of those will find their way into the workplace.
And
so
that's in addition to all the laptops and things
correct,
that are already out there.
Correct, exactly right. So these devices are highly powerful. In fact, mobile devices these days essentially have the same kind of functionality in most cases as PCs do. And these devices have ample storage, lots of functionality, new apps every day, and again are certainly here to stay. So I think it's appropriate for organizations to think about this and worry about this, and then figure out how do you capitalize on the opportunity.
Okay, thanks, Jake. So obviously we should be concerned about this, but what are some of the top risks that are faced by organizations in relation to BYOD? And then how are the risks changing the way the companies have to do business?
Yeah, it's a great question. So obviously these are mobile devices, so these devices are used almost anywhere to connect into the company, and obviously for the employee to do their own personal business. There's a risk of the loss of the device, first of all. And by loss, I don't necessarily just mean the device was lost or it was stolen, but at some point in time, that device will no longer be used by that individual as they upgrade to the newest iPhone or the newest Android or the newest, pick your favorite brand. So the devices have to be, or the devices will be eventually lost or turned over or retired. In addition, increasingly, mobile devices, just like PCs, have the risk of compromise. And there are nearly 5 million unique malware samples in the wild today for mobile devices. Most of those are on Android, but certainly we know iOS is not out of the risk for malware. So really it comes down to loss of device and compromise of device, but the whole BYOD concept adds a unique element to this, which is these devices are not owned by the company. And so companies have to think about, what does that ownership by the employee really mean? Because these devices have corporate data and personal data on the devices. The company is looking to enforce specific controls and encrypt the device and make sure that the device has a passcode and those kinds of things. Employees are going to be resistant to that and want to be focused on productivity and using the device and handing it to their kid to use and those kinds of things. BYOD is also unique in terms of organizations recognize that, or need to recognize that, employee privacy has to be taken into consideration as well. And organizations will want to manage the applications perhaps on the device, or what versions of the operating system are running. And as a result of having that information, employees will be concerned because which apps are running and what data is on the device may tell something about the employee, maybe something private about the employee that they don't feel the organization should need to know, and the organizations frankly don't need to know.
Mm-hmm. So it really comes down to, I mean, you talk about the risks of the loss of the device and the compromising of the device itself, but it really comes down to the data itself, right?
Exactly.
So some folks out there may think, well, my company doesn't have data on my employees' phones. You know, we don't have applications that employees use to access our corporate intranet or something like that. But so what concerns should those type of companies have? I mean, there's still data on that phone. So can you
Absolutely.
expand on that a little bit?
Absolutely. So yeah, even in a model where the device can't be used to connect into VPNs or file shares, even just basic email access is a risk. We know as employees do business in email, there are sensitive files and sensitive information not only contained within email, but in many cases downloaded onto the device, perhaps put onto cloud storage, those kinds of things. So even with a very simple calendar, contacts, and email connectivity model, organizations have to worry about it.
Okay. And then how about a little bit more about the malware situation? How would an employee pick up malware on a mobile device? You know, laptops are pretty evident now. I think people at companies really understand how that works. But what about on a mobile device? How would an employee pick up malware?
Yeah. Really, in many cases, it's very similar to how it would be picked up on a PC. You're browsing in an unsafe way, perhaps visiting sites that are more prevalent to malware. Perhaps you get an attachment or even get a text message with an attachment. So the attachment could be email or it could be text message. And there are increasingly malware that's targeted to Android and iOS devices and really looking to gain access to the device and to the applications and storage on the device and the connectivity of that device, and to be able to then do something malicious with it, whether that's things like SMS toll fraud, which would affect the employee if they're paying the bill, or the company if the company's paying the bill, all the way up to trying to get into and look for and take intellectual property.
Okay. So now you have me concerned, Jake. So, you know, me as a leader at my company, what can I do to effectively manage the risk related to BYOD and the various things that you just described?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, first of all, companies have to take it seriously and have to recognize this as something that has to be addressed. One of the things that we've done, and I think is a very solid best practice, is to put together a program that's encompassing of technology, people, process, and policy, and a governing body to oversee that program. And this governing body needs to be made up of folks from legal and your information security teams and IT, as well as the business, the folks that are using the devices or attempting to use the devices for company business and focused on their own productivity. So putting together this governance board is really, I think, a key element up front to implement the policy, or if it's already in place, to help govern the policy on an ongoing basis, the program on an ongoing basis. In terms of those domains that I mentioned, so from a policy standpoint, considering these are BYOD devices, personally owned devices accessing corporate resources, we need to have policy set explicitly for mobile devices and personally owned mobile devices, and making sure that the policy governs things like what data can be stored on the device, how the device is going to be used and must be used, but also has to make sure that policy is not so controlling that an employee can't be productive. And we have to make sure the policy is not so open that it can't be secured. So finding that balance with those key stakeholders, having a program in place is really going to be critical. On the people side of things, you have to recognize people are your first and best line of defense.
And also your weakest link.
And
right?
clearly your weakest link. And so we have to make sure that we are working with the employees to help them understand and appreciate what risks are prevalent today, how those risks are changing, why policy has to exist, and what the policies are really looking to do to protect not only the company, but their own data and their own information as well. And to help make sure that employees understand the importance of their behavior and actually adhering to, at the end of the day, the policies that we're setting. On the process side, we have to make sure that the processes of the employee getting connected to the company, maintaining that connectivity, using the devices, and then at the end of the day, disposing of that device, hopefully through a chosen disposal of moving to another device and that kind of thing, or perhaps through an unfortunate loss, that those processes are easy to follow as well. And then last, certainly not least, for a technologist like myself, it's important to have technology controls and to actually ensure that we can affect and manage the policies that we decide upon and put into place for the company. Things like wiping the device, whether it's the whole device or a portion of the device that has the company data, enforcing passcode complexity and timeouts, encryption, anti-malware, as we talked about before, certain patch levels of the operating system or of the applications. All of those things are critical and really should have a way, from a technology standpoint, to do some posture checking of that device, whether it's connecting into calendar contacts and email only, or whether it's connecting via Wi-Fi into other resources. Being able to say, does the device have all of these controls in place? Is it adhering to the policy that we decided upon? And then either allowing or denying the connectivity of that device. All of those things really are key parts of how to be successful.
Okay, so that sounds like a lot of stuff, and you mentioned putting a program in place and kind of building some formality around it. Some of our viewers, may not have the resources to do that. So what kind of recommendations would you give? And, can you explain the importance of that formality and in your experience, why that is so important?
Yeah, it really is important to start somewhere, even if it's a small place, to get some stakeholders together that have a vested interest in using devices and securing devices. It's important to have some data to back that up and show that this is not only a problem in the industry, but a challenge and an opportunity that must be capitalized upon for the company itself. Find some friendly stakeholders, in certain parts of the organization, whether that's some folks in legal or some folks in the information security team, some individuals in IT, and start somewhere in terms of forming the board. Begin to show some progress, begin to take some baby steps in the right direction. And then what we found is really that begins to snowball in a way where people increasingly recognize the risks, the importance of the security balanced with the effectiveness of the program and the productivity that mobile devices represent for the company. And again, it just begins to snowball if you start somewhere.
Okay, and so starting with these stakeholders you mentioned, including a variety of different organizations, and I'd have to agree with you that the key ones are legal because of the legality of the issues associated with this. Right. The technologists as well. Obviously, they're the ones who are going to be implementing those things, and then whatever security team you have in place is very important as well. So so thanks for that. Question on the technology: what kind of technologies exist out there to help protect? We talked at kind of a broad scope at this point, but could you dig into that just a little bit more and let the viewers know what kind of technology is available?
Definitely. So certainly the devices and the carriers have combinations of technologies that help, whether it's on the encryption side or whether it's some of the built-in anti-malware or web-based monitoring kinds of technologies. From a corporate standpoint, I think there's a couple of important things to think about. One is the management of the device, or an MDM, a mobile device management tool, the ability to manage policy, enforce policy, monitor and report on the devices that are connecting, and then to be able to take important actions based on what's being found or what's being observed on those specific devices. But increasingly, to your question, organizations need to think beyond just the physical device and recognize that it really is, as you said earlier, about the data and the apps on the device that have the data within them. Protecting the device is certainly a good place to start, but increasingly focusing on mobile application management, focusing on the apps and the data on the device, and a product like Oracle Mobile Security Suite is a great step that has some basic device controls, but also then containerizes the work data, wraps the applications that are used for work in a VPN tunnel, and gives you then the ability to ensure that the data is not moving out of that container, that the data is managed within that VPN tunnel. And so you have basic device protection, you add to that apps and data protection, and you really get a holistic approach from a technology standpoint.
Okay, thanks. Another area that you mentioned that I think is an easy one for companies to implement would be around the people aspect of it and the awareness. Can you talk through a little bit some examples, of awareness, and just demonstrate how easy it might be to get people, understanding what their responsibilities are, what we expect of them, how they can help us secure our company's data and their device as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the places that companies should start is your annual or hopefully frequent employee training, whether it's whatever frequency it is, you have employees go through the training in terms of what the policies are, what the acceptable use is, and it covers a variety of things, including physical security, information security, and beyond. Weaving into that story some focus on mobile devices, and again, the recognition that mobile devices are, by definition, more mobile, more flexible, used in more locations, and yet have that same power that we talked about before. So weaving in the message around mobile device protection and mobile security in general into your standard trainings and standard communications is certainly a great place to start. And then beyond that, one of the things that we've been working on is some additional and specialized mobile security modules, actually focusing on the people that are connecting their devices, and some very quick, not long and drawn out, but some very quick and powerful training modules and key messages to the people that are actually connecting their devices. Again, helping them realize the threats in the world, helping them recognize the importance of the policy, and helping them ensure that they're thinking about it and behaving appropriately at the end of the day.
So I know there's, that sounds pretty serious, right? And there's definitely a place for the serious awareness training, but we've come up, or other people have come up with creative ways of
Yep.
training people as well. Can you give a couple examples of those on how we might make it fun for the employees and pique their interest?
Yeah. One of the things that we've been thinking about and focusing on is some ways from a social grassroots standpoint, actually reaching out to people via their favorite social media engine, or one that you use internally perhaps. We've also been focused on ways to potentially connect kind of a gaming mindset or a more fun mindset to the important topics that you want people to take away at the end of the day, the messages that you have for them. So you're exactly right. There's importance around the formal, more serious kinds of training, and there are a number of ways that I think you can reach out somewhat more informally, more real time, more practically, and more fun to employees, and help them, again, at the end of the day, choose the right behavior.
And I know, in my experience, it depends on the company culture and it depends on what's acceptable at the company. But, there are, some companies take a more serious approach to security awareness, very directive, very formal. Other companies have seen success with some of these more fun and creative ways to get employees to adhere to the policies and to understand their role and responsibility in security at the company. So it's great to see that we're doing a mix of the two. So,
but you're right. There are some companies that are more formal in their culture, and some companies that are more restrictive and have requirements that they must meet in terms of the formality and rigor of the policy, and others that have a more relaxed atmosphere where you still have to have security, but perhaps you can make it a bit more fun, or perhaps you have a little more balance with some of those other factors we mentioned earlier.
Okay. So you just mentioned policy, and I heard the word formality and probably rigidity in there too as well. So talk a little bit about the challenges of having a policy or not having a policy, and why that's so important. You mentioned that as like one of the first things that needed to be done. Explain to us, why that's so important.
Yeah. So obviously, having policy is important, because at the end of the day, employees are going to be focused on what they're required to do or allowed to do at the company. There's a lot of different voices in terms of the process of debating what should the policy be and ultimately deciding upon where it should be. So one of the things that we've really tried to focus on is the importance of having policy, and as security people, we like a little bit tighter policy versus a little bit looser policy. But it's equally important for us as security people to think about the productivity side of this, and the fact that there are benefits to employees, whether that's protection of their own personal data or the recognition that they're behaving securely to protect the company. So helping them to understand the benefits and using not just sticks of policy but carrots of benefits is really, I think, an important way to help get through some of those roadblocks, and recognize even in a world where you don't have all of the policies that you want to from a security standpoint, that may be okay. Let's focus on the benefits and encourage people rather than require people to do the right thing.
Okay, and in many companies, the policy is the way we direct our employees on how to do things. Especially at a large company like Oracle Corporation, the policy is used to provide that direction and a level of awareness as well, and then we couple that with additional awareness training that we put in place.
Right.
So, along the lines of the components of a program here, two of our components in our strategy are visibility and knowledge. Can you talk about the importance of that, and what your recommendations would be for a company who maybe is just starting out and trying to figure out, well, I don't even know how many devices we have. I don't know which ones might be at risk. I don't know what people are using to connect to our network. So can you talk a little bit about how a company might address that?
Yeah, so at Oracle we have this continuum of visibility, knowledge, and action. And at the end of the day, the action that you take is really based upon what are you observing, what are you seeing, and how are you making sense of it. Obviously, you want to focus your actions on the most important things, the highest priority things. So it's critical to have the optics of and the visibility on what's happening across your organization, and certainly increasingly so on the mobile security space, and especially in bring your own device. So you have to have the kinds of technology in place, like we mentioned earlier, the mobile device management or mobile application management tools that help tell you what are employees doing with their connected devices, and have the intelligence or this knowledge piece in the middle that helps make sense of what are we seeing and focusing us on the right areas. So to your point, the companies that don't yet have anything in place, really getting something in place to help centrally manage the connectivity, pull some reporting and data and metrics around how devices are being connected, how they're being utilized, what are we seeing, and how do we make sense of what we're seeing in order to effectively take the action that we need to, when events happen or when we see some anomalies or some problems. Having the visibility and knowledge components really well addressed ahead of time is really critical.
So you mentioned, putting in a system to like an mobile device management system, and many companies might be able to do that, some may not be.
Yep.
So we came up with some creative ways of figuring out how people are connecting to the network, how they're using the system. So can you just expand a little bit on, what we've done with procurement, how we've, looked at the email usage, those types of things, just for some ideas for our viewers of how they might, if they don't have an MDM, how could they go gather some of this information?
Right. So if you don't have an MDM or an MAM and you're heading down that path or want to, absolutely appropriate to recognize there's connectivity happening, whether it's in the Wi-Fi space or whether you're allowing it via ActiveSync or IMAP or some other way in terms of connecting into email. To be able to pull some data and demonstrate this as a challenge and an opportunity for your company and not just one theoretically that you read about in the news is a perfect place to start, and exactly what we've done to really help make the case. That connectivity is happening, and then the natural question is, well, what devices are connecting, and what kinds of protections do those devices have, and how many have passcodes, and how many are encrypted? And you don't have all the answers to those questions, but the fact that you can quantify the scope and scale of the opportunity or of the problem then leads you to obviously the policy proposal and the policy step of introducing an MDM or tuning up your policy and those kinds of things. But I think my point is getting some metrics in place, working with the teams that have the visibility of what devices are connecting, how those devices are connecting, and what it means, what it means in terms of the connectivity from a scope and scale standpoint is a great foot in the door to be able to then focus on policy, and then to be able to focus on technologies that give you more information, better knowledge, so that you can take the actions you need to.
So another one of those ideas that we came up with was working with finance and procurement to identify, people who are getting company paid phones, so that we could get an idea of what the population was. You want to talk about that just a little bit? And it goes back to, identifying those stakeholders that can help you with the success of your program. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Exactly. So we even in cases where we couldn't identify the connectivity was actually happening and how often devices were connecting, to Brennan's point, we had a great relationship with our procurement folks and our information security governance folks, and we're able to work together to actually quantify the number of devices that were being purchased on behalf of Oracle or were being reimbursed to employees in their usage of mobile devices or tablets after the fact. So they may be personally owned, but Oracle may be still paying the bill. So in those cases, we're able to identify not only the counts of employees, but we're able to reach out to those employees, understand a little bit more about their usage, and then begin to take some actions on those individuals. So having the relationships and the stakeholders, and not just throwing in the towel because you don't have the policy you want or don't have the technology that you want. Absolutely important to take those creative steps, and something we've done here at Oracle.
And that visibility and that knowledge has been a key component of our program in order for us to take action, because the the groups here that have a say in this, our stakeholder groups, they want to know what the situation is. They want us to demonstrate the risk. They want to know how big is the scope of our situation. And so putting all this information together was very helpful. So it is important for companies to get very creative on how they get this information. And I go back to it's as simple as looking what we did with laptops. Back when laptops first started coming around. We had to get really creative on figuring out how to address that situation. And this is just like you said, I mean, these are basically small handheld laptops that we're using.
Yeah, and I can't emphasize enough to your point of it's not just industry data, it's not just telling the story in terms of what's happening outside the company, but the more you can tell the story of what's happening inside the company, even if it's not a perfect picture, you're getting creative, you're telling anecdotes, and you're filling in the details with the limited data that you do have. Telling that story in addition to what's happening outside of the company walls is an important part.
Okay, great. So, all right, so we talked about all these different, components of a BYOD security program. We've got policies, we've got people, we've got processes, and we have technology. We talked about some details inside of those programs, inside of those areas, and examples of what we could do there. So we've got all this in place. Now, how do we measure the success of this program? I mean, that's going to be very important because obviously there's a lot of time and effort that's been involved. So how would one of our viewers measure the success of their program?
Yeah, so first and foremost, you have to think about the question and recognize it's an important question to ask yourself. Without the measurement, without the data, to be able to tell the story of what's happening, what's going on, your program will not only be at risk, it will likely fail before it starts. So thinking about how to measure this is really a critical step. One of the first things that we've done is really even though we're focused on security, we want to make sure that we have eyes on the other metrics that are in place from a mobile device use and mobile computing standpoint. So make sure that we know about employee productivity, baseline that, and as we deploy some additional components of policy or process or people or technology, let's make sure that employee productivity, employee satisfaction is not taking a hit. So if we can baseline that, make sure that we have some optics on those measurements as we go forward, that's a key place to start. Secondly, I really like to focus on adoption of the program. So being able to move beyond some of the anecdotes or limited creative data and actually get some real quantifiable data of how many people are bringing their personal devices in, what are the controls on those devices, and being able to report against those. Those are key elements of how I would measure this or how we have measured this at Oracle. You have to have a simple and well-measured lost and stolen device process. The number of devices that are being kind of organically turned over and retired based on the new devices coming out, or how many of those are actually being lost or stolen, what the root cause was, and how that data is trending. All of those are important metrics to have as well. To be clear, at the end of the day, security cannot be difficult for BYOD, or again, your program is going to be really challenged. Security must connect to people in a way where they understand there's a need for it. They know the risks. You've told them about the risks in the environment and the importance of policy and how you're trying to help them manage not only the protection of Oracle data, but their own data as well. I think doing those things demonstrates the success of the program, and again helps to increase the likelihood that employees will behave the way that they need to.
Okay, so one of the ones that really piqued my interest was employee productivity. Can you give some examples of how that might be measured and some of the things that you may have seen in the past that have worked?
Yeah, there's an awful lot of sort of indirect or broader ways to measure this, but mobile devices are great for the company because they allow employees to work from virtually anywhere, virtually any time of the day. So certainly having a connection to executives and lines of business and measuring how productive they are at selling products and selling services and those kinds of things, the very high level metrics for the company is definitely one way to measure productivity. But getting into the more detailed view of the things that we can actually control, or we can maybe make a more direct link to BYOD policies, is really having a very intimate connection with the employees that are connecting their devices. What we found is that by having surveys and questionnaires and ways to actually reach people and ask them about their experience, how was it to set up the device, how was it to maintain the connectivity of the device, how was the process of replacing your device with a newer device, and through that process, questions that are really focused on productivity, not just security, again, helps you to keep a connection into how their usage of the device is, how they're able to be productive and effective within the connectivity model that you've established for them. And then, as a part of that, how secure have you maintained them, or have they maintained themselves as a part of the overall program?
Okay. And, just going back to that stakeholder, discussion that we've been having throughout this conversation, it's really important to understand that you're not in this alone, like especially from measuring employee productivity. There are groups within your IT organization that may already be doing this and have tools and techniques
Right.
of doing that.
Right.
Really important to leverage those. Your corporate communications program as well, or if your IT group has its own communications program, another good place to go and leverage as well. Security people, traditionally aren't the best at, communicating and going through those processes. So I want to let the viewers know that there's a lot of help out there,
Yeah.
and you got to think outside of that box and think broadly on who could help me make success of this program.
Yeah, the more you can demonstrate this is an opportunity that needs to be addressed and a problem that needs to be solved, and you identify the stakeholders that agree with you, and then one of the things that I think we've done very well is demonstrated not only that problem, but shown the progress, shown this is a train that people need to be on, and then you have stakeholders that are interested because they have their own vested interest in this, and because they can see the success snowballing, and they want to be a part of the program, and at the end of the day recognize the need to be a part of this program and the need to keep an eye on security for BYOD.
Okay, so in the measurement area, you touched on security measurements. So I want to just expand on that a little bit more. What types of measurements in that area would we be thinking of? Should we be measuring the security incidents? You talked about the lost devices.
Right.
How would we measure the incidents occurring from malware on a mobile device, for example?
Yeah. So there's certainly an awful lot of technology measurements that you want to focus on, and definitely the most important one is how many incidents are happening from a BYOD standpoint, and really the mobile device incident management process should feed right into the broader incident management process of the company, so that you can obviously measure at the end of the day, but more importantly take the action that you need to as the event is unfolding. So the connection between a mobile incident and event and the broader incident and event management processes of the company is critical. Other technology measurements that really are critical to have your eye on is certainly first and foremost how many devices are connecting, and then how many of those devices are maintaining the policies and the controls that you have in place. If you're not able to enforce them all, you should at least report on how many are jailbreaking or rooting their device, for example. How many older versions of operating systems and application patch levels are existing out there. How many devices are not encrypting, and being able to tell that story. And then ideally, at the end of the day, if you can make a connection between those metrics and the incidents and demonstrate that tighter controls are needed, I think that helps at the end of the day sell itself.
Okay. And so really you talked about two different types of information. One was around incidents themselves, and then the other was like compliance data, right?
Correct.
And that compliance data is very difficult to measure if you don't have a policy. So we're kind of back to one of the foundational aspects of a BYOD program would be BYOD security program would be a good policy to have, so that you can go and monitor that compliance, you can evaluate against that policy, and everybody has the same understanding of what's expected and what kind of controls should be in place.
Yeah, it's a great point, and recently it was termed in one of our meetings as policy is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. It doesn't mean you can't make progress if it's not there, but it is a key thing to focus on, and a BYOD security program shouldn't be without a focus on policy.
The other point that I pulled out of that that discussion we just had was the importance of an inventory and an asset management inventory. How would companies go about getting that with mobile devices, especially in a BYOD type of situation? Can you just share some experiences you've seen with that?
Yeah, so certainly the easiest way is via a mobile device management product or an MDM component of a mobile application management product, to be able to, as devices connect and as employees are registering those devices, you have an asset management inventory, and then as a part of that can connect the inventory of the total number of devices connecting and to the types of devices, the security posture of those devices, and then you eventually begin to get to a maturity where you actually allow or deny access to services based on what you're seeing on those devices. Certainly there are other creative ways to utilize your Wi-Fi access points, utilize your access and authentication technologies, INAM technologies, and other ways that employees may be connecting their personally owned devices and kind of cobble together that inventory. Obviously, maintaining the privacy aspect is one thing, but if employees are choosing to connect these devices to the corporate resources, we have a need to understand how many devices, what kind they are, how their security looks, and again, it leads to that action component we talked about earlier.
Okay. So one other key area that we haven't really touched on is on the application space. We know that that's definitely a key concern and a key risk. You touched on it in the very beginning, talking about the risks. So what should our viewers be concerned about related to the application space, and what kind of things are available out there? We've talked about the device, the physical device itself, the operating system on the device, but we all know in the security world that applications are a huge risk to us. So can you talk about some things in that area?
Yeah, definitely. I was just recently looking at some data that said mobile anti-malware samples are increasing exponentially year over year. It seems like every 6 months or so they're doubling and doubling again, and a big portion of that is the applications that are running on the devices. In a perfect security world, you're limiting the app stores that employees can get to the iTunes store for Apple and Google Play for the Android devices. So if you can get to that mode, you have an easier time of it, because most of those applications are vetted in some way through the ability to get into the App Store. But certainly there are an awful lot of additional places employees can get applications installed. And in a world where you can't control which stores they're coming from, then what you have to have is some additional functionality on the device to actually check for malware and that sort of thing. So that's one way to focus on applications. Ideally, which is where Oracle is going and where other companies are going, is this idea of a mobile application management tool, where you have the basic device functionality that we talked about, and you add to it this containerization and this VPN tunneling, which allows you then to control the Oracle data or the corporate data, and make sure that data is not making its way onto the personal part of the device, or via some malicious application actually finding its way off of the device and into somebody else's hands. I recently read a statistic that something like just a fraction of 1% of the applications in the iTunes and Google Play Store have been found to be malicious. A higher percent are higher risk because they have access to services that you really don't want them to. But if we focus on just the malicious, it's a fraction of 1%. Outside of those two main Play stores and Google Play and iTunes, the other stores that people can get devices from, in some of those cases, the random samples have shown 15, 20, 25% of applications are malicious, just downright malicious in nature. So
that's a huge difference.
It's a huge difference. And again, at the end of the day, as a security person, I really want to focus on those two main stores. In a world where you can't control that, you have to have other ways to actually look at the apps and figure out what the apps may or may not be doing with the data, and at the end of the day, protect the data.
So I mean, having your own mobile app store sounds like a pretty big undertaking, right, for a company. I mean, is it really that big of a deal? And what would be the risk profile that would push a company into that type of scenario?
I think it's the right thing to do for really a company of even a medium size, frankly. It's not that much work to set it up. You can have ways of pulling public apps into your private app store, and then you get the benefit of publishing apps that you want employees to use into the private app store. And again, as we talked about earlier, incenting people or providing the benefits that if you want to get to those apps, you have to register your device, or you have to walk through the steps that we want employees to walk through. It's not a big undertaking. It is something that we recommend in terms of having a private app store, and certainly something that many companies should and do take advantage of.
Okay, great. So a lot of components to this program, a lot of moving parts that need to be managed, and that's why we talk about having a formality of a program wrapped around it. But what are some of the key challenges that companies are going to face when they're trying to implement a program of this type?
Yeah. I think first and foremost is not striking the balance between security and productivity. This is where we started the discussion, I think an appropriate kind of way to bring it to a close. You have to have a balance on security and productivity. And again, the security people will be challenged to think on the productivity side, and perhaps the business or other stakeholders will be challenged to think about things from a security point of view. But getting that program board together, making sure that folks realize the inherent conflict that's out there, and to strive for that balance in your program. And if you don't quite find the sweet spot and you need to make those adjustments, those course corrections along the way, that's fine. But I think that's a big one, is that programs that tend to one extreme or the other and don't have that balance of representation from a stakeholder standpoint and that balanced perspective, I think that's definitely one of the big challenges in my mind. Another I think key challenge is that organizations don't think of things in the four categories that you mentioned of people, process, policy, and technology. If you are focused too much on a perfect policy, but you don't have the technology to enforce it, or you focus on great technology, but you don't have the support to get a policy in place, and if you ignore the fact that people are your first and best line of defense, and in many cases your weakest failure point as well, that's going to be a challenge. And if at the end of the day you're not making the process as simple to follow, you're going to have a real difficult time and a real challenge. So I think that's kind of the second one that I would call out. And then third, which I've talked a little bit about, is just the failure to involve all of the right people. Getting people on your side, involving the legal, the procurement, the HR, the business folks, your IT groups, your information security teams, folks that have different benefits or different angles on the program, getting them to provide their voices, be a part of the program, get on board with it. I think that is a key success criteria here and a key challenge if you don't do it right.
Okay, so you talked about getting the people on board with the program. What about the users themselves, right? So you referenced a younger generation, right? Maybe a social media generation at the beginning of our discussion. So, that person and maybe, other employees are like, well, you're not touching my phone, right? So how do we get over that hump? I mean, the stakeholders, obviously we need to get over that, but it's the general user, right, and the productivity. So how do we get over that challenge with them?
Yeah, I think you have to make sure as a part of the program that you have their voices heard as well. It's easier for some of us who are older to think about some of the good old days of you tell me exactly what device I have to use and you provide that device to me, and the world is a happy place. First of all, the recognition of and the adoption of a BYOD program where you tell that millennial coming in, you can use essentially whatever device you want to. If you choose to connect it to the company, there are a few things that we need you to do, and this is for your protection and for the protection of the company. We've found a lot of success in that, and making sure their voice is a part of the program so you understand their use cases. How are they using their phone? How are they connecting it? When are they working? Those kinds of things. Absolutely something you have to incorporate into the program, not something you can skip over. Pretty soon the millennials will take over these companies that we have today, and recognizing and supporting their use of their own devices is certainly a key part of how we're going to be successful.
Yeah, and I do think this is the way that companies are going to need to do business. I mean, if I look back on when these types of devices started making their way into the market and into the big companies, I remember talking to other CISO level folks and them saying, we'll never allow BYOD in my company. And these are highly regulated industries, and now it's a part of their business, right? I mean, and it's going to happen. So, as we've discussed, we really need to embrace this and figure out how to deal with it over time.
Definitely.
And hopefully, the content that we provided today and the discussion that we provided today will help our viewers, understand some of the basics and how to go about that. And I really thank you for your time, Jake.
Thank you. Great discussion.
Thanks.